Last week we were working on GCF, which my fifth graders probably remember me teaching and saying GCF is greatest common factor. So, and what do we use greatest common factor for? Usually, we can use it for many other things, but usually what we use it for is to simplify our fractions. When you come up with an answer, when you have a fraction, for it to be all the way right, it needs to be in simplest form, which means we need to find the GCF and simplify or reduce. So last week we did the GCF of two numbers, which, as you remember, you just find the factor that they have in common. Now, sometimes they have two factors in common, two or more factors in common. And then what we do in that case is we find the biggest factor that they have in common. And then that number is called the greatest common factor. So today, we're going to take it one step further and look at three numbers and find the greatest common factor. So I've written out three numbers. We're going to find the greatest common factor of 10, 15, and 30. So in order to find our greatest common factor, we're really going to need to know our divisibility rules. And if you remember in last week's videos when we were talking about the greatest common factor of two numbers, the divisibility rules that we used were if the number's even, which means it ends in a 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, it can always be divided by 2. But another rule that we also used is if the number ends in 0 or 5, then we can always divide by 5. So, if that's the case, these numbers all end in either 0 or 5. So that makes a pretty strong case of what the greatest common factor might be. However, instead of guessing, we're going to find the greatest common factor. So that way we don't have a 50-50 chance of getting the question right. We've been through the steps, we did the steps, and we know our answer's right, or at least we're pretty confident. So, before we can go through the steps, you've got to know the steps. So, let me teach you the steps. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do, let's write out our numbers in a little chart. 10, 15, and 30. And you can divide them off and put the lines if you want. It just makes things more organized, in my opinion. Let's drop my lid. Alright, just like that. So, now, what we're going to do is we're going to list the factors of each of these numbers. So, every number in the world, every number, has what number as a factor? 1. And 1 times any number is that number. So, for instance, if we have 1 times 100, it would be 100. So, 1 times 10 is 10. So 1 and 10 are factors of 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 1 and that number for everyone. 1 and 15. So 1 times 15 is 15. So those are both factors. And 1 and 30. 1 times 30 is 30. So those are both factors also. Now comes the fun part. So 10 is even. And we know that because it ends in 0. So, all even numbers divide by what? 2. Right. So that means 2 is a factor of 10. Now, 2 times what equals 10? Right. 2 times 5 equals 10. So the factors of 10 are 1, 2, 5, and 10. Pretty easy. Okay. So let's do 30 because 30 is even. So we know that all even numbers divide by 2, as we just said with 10. So 2 times what is 30? Or another way of saying that is 30 divided by 2 is what? And if you don't know off the top of your head, that's okay. You can always do the division box. 30 goes under the house, and 2 goes on the outside. Just like that in the bottom corner. And that could be your scratch work on your piece of paper. However, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, and this is a common one, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you 2 times 15 is 30. But 30 is a pretty big number. So we're going to keep going with factors for 30. So 30 begins in a 3. So I'm going to venture to guess that 3 is a factor. So let's write down 3. Now, 3 times what equals 30? Or another way of saying that is 30 divided by 3 equals what? Very good. 10. So another factor of 30 is 3 and 10. Now, there's one more factor of 30, and going on the divisibility rules that we talked about earlier, all numbers that end in 0 or 5 can be divided by what? Very good. They can all be divided by 5. So, if you're taking notes with me, which I would hope you are, our divisibility rules, any number that's even can always be divided by 2, and any number that ends in 0 or 5 can always be divided by 5. Now, let's look at 15. So it ends in a 0 or 5, and in this case it ends in a 5, so it can be divided by 5. So we know 5 is one factor. So 15 divided by 5 is what? That's right, it's 3. Now comes the second fun part. Looking what all of these numbers have in common. So 15 and 30 both have 3 in their factors, but 10 doesn't. So we can't use 3 because they all 3 have to have a 3 here. 10 and 30 have a 2, but 15 doesn't. So we can't use 2 because, once again, they all 3 have to have this number in common. But look, 10, 15, and 30 have a 5 in common. So that means that the number that they have in common, or the greatest common factor, is 5. And if you want to put a circle around that to remind you that the greatest common factor is 5, then that's great. And if you don't, if you're confident and can remember it, then that's fine also. But just to touch on it, just to show you, when you have 3 numbers, this is how you find the greatest common factor. It's really not that much harder than 2 numbers. there's just an extra step, and I want you to be aware of that extra step as you move forward and go into harder problems. So we will revisit this, but right now I just wanted to touch on it. So if you're ever presented with a problem like this, you don't get overwhelmed, you don't get upset, you don't freak out by it. You know how to handle it. So just go step by step, go slow, and think back to the things that we learned. So we'll have more on the greatest common factor of 3 numbers. We'll revisit the greatest common factor of 2 numbers, and then we'll move on from there. All right. Thank you very much, and I'll have more videos coming your way.